Welcome to Growth Beyond Boundaries, the podcast by the Astra Coach Alliance that explores the transformative power of coaching, leadership, and innovation. I'm your host, Andy Huckaba, and I'm so excited to have you join us. Here at the Astra Coach Alliance, we believe growth isn't just a goal, it's a journey. Whether you're a leader striving to inspire your team, a professional seeking your next breakthrough, or an organization ready to transform your culture, this podcast is for you. Each segment, we bring you stories, strategies, and insights from our team of seasoned coaches and leaders across industry. Together, we'll discover innovative approaches to fostering a culture built on success, accountability, and collaboration, rooted in both challenging and compassionate coaching practices. So if you're ready to go beyond boundaries and discover what's possible, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Episode 28, Transitions. Today we're diving into transitions, the space between what was and what's next. Change is situational, but transition is the inner process of letting go, reorienting, and stepping into possibility. It can feel uncertain, even uncomfortable, but it's also where creativity and growth take root. In this episode, we'll explore how transitions mirror the seasons, why the neutral zone matters, and what leaders can do to guide themselves and others through these moments with clarity and compassion. Today, I welcome MCC coach and one of my dear partners, Teresa Schwab. Welcome, Teresa.
Hi, Andy. It's great to be with you. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you. Shall we talk about transitions?
We should talk about transitions. Absolutely. And I was just thinking in preparation for this, we are transitioning from summer into autumn, but it does not feel like that today at all. It's like in the 80s today and it's really hot. So what's happening with that?
Yeah, well, September here in the Kansas City area has been much warmer than it usually is. And so, yes, the trees are confused and the animals are confused. And I think the people are confused too, because it's not the change they expect.
I think you're right. Absolutely. So you excited to talk about this today.
Yeah. So you talk about seasons. And I was doing some reflection on transition as well. And you start to think about seasons of life, but also just seasons. I mean, seasons are transitional. When, you go from summer to fall, generally the weather gets cooler, the trees change, they drop their leaves. The sounds change, the feel in the air changes, the activities change, people go back to school, all sorts of different things. What people wear changes. People are done with vacations generally from the summer, lots of changes. And so I kind of laid out this idea of seasons, and I'm curious, Teresa, your response to them after I read them. The season of fall, its transition phase is one of ending, letting go, release something, honoring endings. The season of winter is more like a neutral zone where there's some dormancy, there's uncertainty, and there's a lot of reflection going on. The spring season are like new beginnings, where you have emergence, renewal, and experimentation. And the summer season is more integration as a transition phase. The key themes are flourishing, alignment, and celebration. So these are kind of interesting to think about when you start to look at the movement of transition and change. And I'm curious your ideas and thoughts around that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's important to delineate the difference between change and transition. Change is something that happens to you and is something that often happens pretty quickly, but the transition is actually the process through which you go through in order to adjust to the change. And if we think about that on a large scale, multiple people going through multiple different transitions at any given time complicates change a lot. And really what we're talking about is William Bridges' work around change and transition, where he really delineates the difference between change as something that happens to you and transition is the psychological process that people go through when they respond to change. And that every change, just like the Semisonic song, I always think about it. I'm not going to sing it, I'll spare you. But the lyrics of that song are every new beginning comes with some other beginning's end. I always think about that when I think about change and transition, because there is a loss associated with change. And it's oftentimes why we resist change. We're not resisting the change itself frequently. It's the resistance to the loss that we're experiencing as a result of that change. But going through that process, there is a period of great innovation and creativity if we can withstand the uncertainty that comes along with that point. But then if we do a lot of really great work and get creative and innovative, we can build sort of the energy for that new beginning. And then we get enough people that are interested in that new beginning, and then we can integrate. It's a very nice way to think about it through those seasons that you've offered as a framework to think about going through change.
Yeah. Thanks for the definition there, the differences between change and transition. Paraphrasing what you said, change is situational. It's like a job change or a relocation or a reorganization or something of that nature, where transition is more of a psychological, the inner reorientation, meaning making that follows change. And so I'm kind of paraphrasing almost exactly what you said, but in different words that hopefully some of those can land with our listeners. What does transition look like? I mean, we talk about it and that's almost like an academic thing, but what are things that you think about when you think of transitions? What have you experienced? What have you seen?
Well, so I would offer two things. One is like even positive things that happen to us create a transition. So even positive changes create moments where sadness might happen or fear might happen or uncertainty grabs a hold of us, even if we like the change. Like let's use a really great one. So let's say you won the lottery and let's say you won big, like you won, the multi-millions, right?
I had a dream about that once.
Well, and that would be really awesome. And if you believe the stories and the data that's out there, of course, that, a lot of people who win the lottery actually end up pretty miserable. And the thing about winning the lottery is having all that money would be amazing. And think about all the amazing things and all the great things you could do and the lovely things that you could buy and the people you could treat to things and buy things for and pay for college and all these amazing things you could do. And yet suddenly it sets you apart from other people. Yet suddenly you start to not trust people because everyone's coming to you for money. And now you don't know who your real friends are or who you're not. So there's this transition. Even in a really good change, there are going to be things that are going to end, things that you're going to mourn, things that are going to feel new and different and weird when you're taking on a new role. So I think even using something like winning the lottery, you can start to see why not everything's all sunshine and roses when it comes to change. And then I think just even on a personal note, as you know, my last child just graduated from high school and we're in a period of empty nesting and it's been a massive change in our household. But the transition that we're going through to being empty nesting is really hard. It's, every day there's sort of this new thing of, oh, I'm not a parent anymore. And even though I am a parent, I'm not the same kind of parent. So now I'm in this period of trying to figure out, well, I'm still a parent, but I'm not the kind of parent I was. So I'm losing this identity. I'm not the parent that goes to soccer games and sits in the stands. I'm not the parent that, counsels my kids on a daily basis or gets them where they need to go or comforts them when they're sad. Those aren't the things I see or am around every day. So now I have to figure out how do I parent children who are on their way to independence or who are independent, it's a shedding of identity it's really hard and kind of unexpected until you're in the middle of it and you start to recognize there are a lot of things that end in those processes that you
Right.
have to work through. And by the way, I'm not going through it alone. My husband's also going through it. And
Sure.
he's going through it at a different in a different way, but also at a different pace than I am. And that's the interesting thing about leadership and leading change in an organization is that not every person goes through that psychological process of transition in the same way. So we have to meet them where they are and sort of engage people in whatever pace they're going through the change, which means that we might have to adjust pretty frequently to try to meet people where they are in that journey.
Yeah, that's a good illustration with the last kid going to college. My experience and it's been a while, when our last kid went to college was more of celebration because it was the third kid. But there was a change. There was a loss because so much of our lives revolved around the activities of our kids, right? And then when they go off to a college or somewhere to work, all of a sudden your everyday activity doesn't revolve around them. And so then what does it revolve around?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of that gray area, right? That area that you're being contemplative, that you're thinking about, that you're missing something, you've lost something, and yet you know that there's something to look forward to. You just haven't identified it.
Yeah, and what you're naming is in that neutral zone as you described it and as Bridges describes it. There's a tension in there.
Yeah.
There is the thing that sort of tugs you back as you're sort of remembering things and mourning whatever you're losing. But you're also like, but wait a minute, there's real possibility here. My husband and I had a conversation the other day. It's like, we're like 18 years old again and going to college. It sort of feels like that. It's like, oh man, like, what do we want to do with the rest of our lives? I don't know. Like, there's all this possibility and space that we just haven't had for so long. So there's this tension in between that space. And if you embrace it, there's great possibility there. And you really do need to pay attention and acknowledge, mourn, whatever the process is that you need to go through to let go of those things that you're shedding while you're becoming what's possible. There's a tension in that I think is real.
Yeah. The Go on, talk more about that.
The tension in there, in some ways, I think this is part of what's hard about this process is that in some ways it's like if I let go of what I had, then somehow I'm betraying what I had. I think like, is it okay for me to be glad that my kids are growing up and becoming adults so that I have this extra time? And I think there's some of that tension in there too. And of course, if you think about it from your head perspective, the answer is, of course it is. Like, of course it's okay. And yet your heart and your gut are sort of tugged backwards.
Right.
But, in many ways, when you've been wearing a certain coat for a long time and you have to take that coat off and maybe you didn't really want to take it off. Maybe it wasn't your choice. Maybe the change happened to you. It wasn't a choice you made. You might go a little bit slower into what the next phase is. And again, I think that's what's complicated. And I think the opportunity is really leaning into what's possible. What could the future look like? What do I want the future to look like? What are the possibilities that exist here? And if you're a leader in an organization, those are some really great questions that you can ask the people that you're leading through change and transition. And I think we need to be careful in here not to be too Pollyanna, because if we're careful and we're paying attention to people. Some people might not be ready to hear the question, what's possible here? They might need to be acknowledged for what they're losing. They might need some space to talk about and mourn and be sad about what they're losing versus being sort of forced ahead into what the future is. Because I would imagine if I'm in that space and I'm crying to my best friend about my kids going to college, and my best friend's like, yeah, but think about all the things you could do. I would just feel disregarded. And so I think that's the leader's job, is to tend to that tension that exists in that space too. Some people might need acknowledgement. Some people might be a little bit slower. Some people might need some help thinking their new identity. Some people might be like, why didn't we make this change 17 years ago? Like, we should have done this a long time ago, and they may be out way ahead of you. So I think there's a really interesting job for a leader in that space, especially in large change initiatives where you have people who are kind of all over the place.
Right. I've had clients who have lost a job,
Mhm.
high-level jobs, who are kind of caught in this position of what should I have done differently, or what could I have done differently? What do I need to wrap up, and what's next? It's that just funny space. And it's interesting to work with them and get them to reflect. And yet it's also an opportunity for them to kind of get up on the balcony, KLC term, right? But get up on the balcony and look at what has happened and make a less emotional analysis of where they were, what they feel good about, what they're leaving, and then hopefully make a transition to what's next. And it's an interesting dynamic to work with somebody that has gone through that kind of change, which might be different than the type of change, like you mentioned, a kid going off to college, or somebody being promoted within an organization. That has changed too.
It's huge.
Right? And transition. They go through the emotional transition of almost having one foot in each bucket. And how do I finish up well here so that I can move on to here and do the best I possibly can? And what does that look like? And so there's lots of unknowns, lots of uncertainty, and the transition's real.
For sure. And on that last one you were talking about, we hear this a lot in coaching where people get promoted and they might come in and say, why don't I feel as excited about this as I should? Like, this is a great opportunity for me. I'm making more money. I have more influence. I have more power in the system. I have more ability to change things. Why am I feeling or experiencing what I'm feeling and experiencing? And part of that might be the loss of relationships when you change your position and you go from individual contributor to a management position or go further up in the organization. Suddenly the relationships that you had, the people you went out to margaritas with after work with, the kinds of people you sat around the water cooler and had lunch with changes. You might have to change offices. You might be in a whole new part of a building that you don't love as much. There are all kinds of things that could shift and happen for you when you go through that. So I think that's another thing to help and support people is when they go through change, even if they're happy about the change, there may be some tug on them that's feeling like I should feel happier about this, but I don't. And that's a really nice way to lean in as a coach and say, okay, what might you be losing here? What are the things that you're giving up that you might be experiencing some sadness about, or, something that helps them sort of process what they're giving up. Because again, I don't think the giving up is always bad. Sometimes it is. But it doesn't mean we feel any less emotion about it.
Sure.
We still feel sad.
Yeah.
And I think about, like even technology changes. I joke about this frequently when I teach classes on change and transition. I always sort of hold up my cell phone and go, this is why I don't get a new phone. Because If I go get a new phone, that means I'm going to feel completely incompetent because I know how to use this phone. I know where all the buttons are. I know where all the apps are. I've got
Right.
everything in this phone exactly like it is. If I go get another phone, I'm suddenly not going to know what I'm doing. I'm going to feel incompetent. I'm going to feel inefficient. I'm not going to like that feeling. And furthermore, who am I going to have to turn to? My children, who are then going to make fun of me because I don't know what I'm doing. So I have to suffer at their hands of and making fun of me that I don't know what I'm doing. But even like changes like that, I think a loss of competence shows up pretty frequently where you might see some resistance to change because people are
Yeah.
like, we've always done it a certain way, and you hear that a lot. We've always done it this way. Why do we have to change? What they're saying is, I feel competent doing the way that we've always done it. I don't feel competent moving into this new place. What they'll often say is it doesn't make any sense to change it. We've always done it. It's if it's not broke, don't fix it. There are all kinds of
Right.
excuses that you'll hear, but really underneath that, what they're saying is I feel really certain and competent doing it the way we've always done it. And I don't really want to experience the feeling of uncertainty or incompetence by changing.
Right. When you and I visited before about this topic, not recorded, but just visited to throw ideas back and forth, one of the things we talked about was the leader's perspective on change. And if you layer over that the idea of seasons, that you have employees that are in different seasons of their lives, you have some employees who are aging out of the workforce. You have some employees who've been there for a while and are in a certain space. You have some who are just beginning, right? And so, really, all four of the seasons, from a lifestyle season standpoint, are probably covered. What does that mean to leadership?
It's such a great question. It's an interesting opportunity, I think, for people to think about how to work across generations. So, an HR friend of mine recently said this is the first time in the history of the workforce there have been potentially five generations in the workforce at the same time. And I know that you hear this as frequently as I do in coaching and when we're teaching that things like if they just don't want to come to work, or they just don't want to do it, or they just they want to get promoted without putting in the work. And then you hear from the other generations, well, they just want to do it the way it's always been done. And there's this sort of us them dynamic that gets set up, and there's this sort of frustration among the generations. And I think this idea of change and transition gives us a real interesting opportunity to think about how do we come from a position of appreciating the transition that somebody at any particular generation may be going through, and then using that appreciation to work across generations? Like, I think about, for instance, folks who are in the last part of their career who may be thinking about retirement, somebody who's maybe spent their whole life dedicated to the organization, or at least to the mission that the organization has. Maybe they've moved around to different positions, but maybe they've dedicated their life to something and they feel really proud of the contributions that they've made. And now they're thinking about retirement and thinking about, they're kind of like the empty nester, right? In a different phase of life,
Right.
like, oh, I'm not going to have work to go to every day. That makes me sad. And yet I've got all this opportunity to do all these other things I
Hmm.
could do. So there's that tension again. But what about the opportunity for folks who are younger, instead of saying, oh, they never want to change and they just always want to do things the same? What if they said, you know what, you've made amazing contributions here. I bet there's lots of really interesting things I could learn from you and your perspective. So, what are the most important things you've learned through your career? And what are the bits of advice that you feel like I should have and be thinking about as I move forward into this career? I mean, think about the opportunity to work across those generations by just meeting them where they are in terms of their transition and appreciating it and using it to create more effective relationships. I think
Right.
that's super powerful.
Well, and then there's also an awareness or a realization that I used to be, if I'm in one of the later generations, which I am, I used to be one of those people in the early generations that the people were complaining about, and I was complaining about them in the same
Yeah.
way they're complaining today. And so
Right.
there's this, well, they're impatient. They don't want to, go through the steps to learn things the right way. They don't understand how to work with people, whatever, right? And talking about the incoming generation. And when you begin to get them to become more aware of these, how people change over time, how they transition over time, they become more tolerant of that attitude. All of a sudden it becomes like, oh yeah, I remember when I was like
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
right? I remember when, and the harder part is to get the younger generations to have an appreciation for what the older generations are going through. The older generations can always reflect back and look, but the younger
If they're willing.
generations, if they're willing, right,
Yeah.
right. So it's those dynamics are really interesting. And the question is through good management practices and good leadership within an organization, how can you use the best of those four seasons?
Yeah. Well, I was actually thinking about something else that I was going to add relative to the younger generation, because you think about the transition they're going through. So the first generation in your organization just left college. They're eager. They have lots of great ideas. And if we can appreciate them, they're coming into the organization with a fresh set of eyes. So they're not biased. They're not already into the culture. They see things from a very different perspective. It's a little bit more objective when they first come in. So if we get curious about those brand new people in the organization and saying, okay, so what are you noticing here? What are we missing because we've been swimming in this water for so long? What are these interesting and new ideas that you're bringing in? I can't necessarily promise we can implement them, but maybe there are some things that we could take advantage of. Again, think about the opportunities that offers for an organization to really, number one, create a more empathetic and understanding culture that's building trust
Right.
within the organization, but also reducing the conflict among those generational differences, because they're so stark. I just hear them all the time, and the definitiveness with which people talk about them. Like, well, if they would just, and it's pretty much like that. Sometimes, I
Right.
put a spin on a tone, but this is really the tone that comes out is like, well, if they would just, well, if they would only, well, they just won't. It's like, wait a minute, like we're all in this together. So if we could use the we language and get really curious about where people are, it really opens up just a plethora of opportunities for us to sit together in that uncertainty when an organization is going through change. And I think the other thing to notice here, maybe coming back to your idea of these seasons, is that there's not just one change going on at any one time. That's what makes change and transition so complex, because organizations are typically going through several major changes, and many of them don't even complete a change before they move that change into a different kind of change before the first change was ever implemented or
Right.
completed. And everything is moving at the speed of light. So it's like these multiple changes happening all the time. So if you think about your psychological response, you're not just having one psychological response, you're having multiple psychological
Yeah.
responses to all these different changes going on at the same time.
It's almost
So I
like
think,
playing whack-a-mole, right?
yeah, all the time, which can leave people feeling really exhausted.
Right. Yeah, the complexity there is mind-boggling. What else should our leaders within organizations, as they navigate the change and the dynamics of transition of people, what else should they consider?
Well, it seems like keeping the mantra in their mind that change happens quickly, but transition is a process. So we can't just anoint a change and expect that everyone's going to jump on board. So I think going in with a changed expectation helps. So by knowing that their change isn't just going to make everybody happy, that there is a process that every single person's going to go through, and that your job as a leader is actually not to create the change. Your job as a leader is to get everyone through their transition to the change process. And interestingly enough, this is a concept from Marty Linsky and Ron Heifetz in Leadership on the Line, is that they define leadership as disappointing your own people at a rate they could tolerate. Because the reality is, and they talk about this, that in a lot of change initiatives, there will be casualties. And those casualties might be the people who can never really see themselves embracing the new change. Folks who look at the change and go, I can't get on board. I don't want to face feeling incompetent. I don't want to embrace a new identity. I don't agree with this. The loss is too great for me and I'm out. And many times in especially larger changes, either in your life or in an organization, people will choose to leave or exit. And it's a concept I think we don't really like to talk about very much, but it does happen. And maybe a leader's job in those cases is just to recognize that that's the case. And even people who choose not to come along, we can treat them empathetically. We can say, I can see that this change is really just too hard for you, or it's something you don't want to embrace. And I get that. And how can I help and support you in whatever your next thing might be? So there are ways, I think, to just acknowledge where people are, what they can accept, what they can't accept, and just support them through it.
Yeah. And recognition that people move through their transitions at different rates. This is almost a mantra that you and I teach when we're in front of a class of managers, but that's part of managing people, is knowing your people, knowing how they work through change and transition and what that looks like to them, and allowing for that and recognizing that there could be some things that people just throw their arms up and say, I can't do it. And that's kind of a reality that's out there, right? Many years ago, I was part of a corporation, and we did a lot of business reengineering work, kind of early business reengineering work. I think I probably made this statement or I stole it from somebody, but it's like when change happens too fast, the people who can leave and the people who don't think they can hunker down. That's kind of an interesting dynamic if you look at it. So does happen. And so from a leader standpoint, or somebody in leadership, what does it look like to manage the rate of change? Recognizing that too much can cause everything to explode or implode in some cases, and too little doesn't move you forward as an organization. And this podcast isn't about change necessarily, it's about transition, but the two are inherently linked together.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you have a lot of people going through multiple transitions, it gets complicated. Because here's another way to think about this, is change really is it's an analytical process. It's a profit loss, risk benefit, ROI analysis. But the transition is, as we've called it, it's a psychological process, which means it's not a head process, it's a heart and gut process. So managing all of those emotions when you're in transition, emotion is involved, period, end of story, because we're human. So if we're upset, if we're feeling vulnerable, if we're feeling uncertain, there are lots of responses that we have to that: fear, resistance, conflict, anger, frustration, sarcasm, not showing up for work, taking more sick leave. There are lots of things that people do in response when they're feeling that level of emotion, when the change is overwhelming. So I think you're really smart to talk about how part of a leader's job is also to think about rate and pace of change and how many changes are happening at any given time. And that's part of what a leader can use their authority for, is to really make decisions strategically about how much of this can we tolerate at this moment. Should we put some things off until we get through some other things because we need to get people moved? Need to get more people moved to the change before we start something else, because it's exhausting. And once people get exhausted, then we see burnout. And if we've got people who are burned out and not motivated, we're not getting the best out of them. There are lots of cases to be made why it's important for leaders to pay attention in the way that you're describing.
Yeah. So one of the things we talked about before this podcast, but I think we should incorporate it in all future podcasts, is this idea of what are some of the practical tools and reflective questions that we can put out there for our audience to begin to consider as they're working through transition, or they're working with their people through transitions. And, I'll say both you and I are professional coaches, and we ask a lot of questions and we reflect a lot on these types of things. And so some of these ideas are going to come from our experience in being coaches. So where do we start? What are some of the practical tools or reflective questions that people should consider?
Well, I think questions are a tool, and I think questions are one of the best tools that we have at our disposal in leadership, generally speaking, but in particular, when we're talking about transition, I think it's a really incredible tool. So I think about questions like, if you're in the middle of a change, you can ask yourself questions, or if you're leading a team through a change, you can ask the team questions. Tools that you can use either for your own self-reflection or you can use for a team. What is ending for you? Just really getting clear about what is the ending that's at play here, and what is the ending for me? What does that ending mean to you? Like on a practical basis, like what does it actually look like? What does it actually feel like? How does it actually impact you? How will the ending or endings impact you or the people around you? What is that emotional response that you're feeling or the people around you are feeling? What do you need to let go of? Could be a really powerful question. What do you need to mourn or acknowledge in order to move forward? What is uncertain to you? What feels uncertain? What is that experience that you're having that's actually uncertain? Which might lead to a different kind of question, like, where do you feel vulnerable? And that's a whole different question to ask yourself.
Question. Right.
Do you feel kind of vulnerable in the middle of change? Another interesting question could be, who in the change are you outpacing? Who are you out in front of? And what are the expectations that you have for them that they might be disappointing? So this question about pace, who are you outpacing? Here's a really powerful one that you were talking about earlier, is what is waiting to emerge? What's possible here in this moment? What's waiting to emerge, or what's waiting to be born, or what kinds of things could come out of this that could be really cool? And what are the opportunities for you? Those are all really great reflective questions that can become a really good tool in helping both yourself or people you manage or supervise or teams that you lead walk through that period of uncertainty that they might be experiencing in transition.
Yeah, and so it seems like somebody who's in transition can take the time, hopefully they can take the time to be more reflective like that and work through those transitions. But sometimes that seems like it could be problematic with the team, where the team's goal is to go, 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 right? Do they allow themselves that opportunity as a team to be more reflective before they move to the next step? Or is the pressure for the team to go superseding that? Feels like a trap to me.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we're kind of dancing around that we haven't talked about is the difference between authority and leadership. So, with a role of authority in an organization, you have power. And with that power, you can make choices. And sometimes with your power and authority, you can anoint a change. You can say, we're going to make this change. That's your decision. You can't anoint people agreeing with the change. That demands leadership. That means I have to dance with people. I have to think about the pacing. I have to ask these kinds of questions. But one of the things you can do from your position of authority, especially in the midst of transition, is to give people permission to slow down. If you're in a culture that is run, 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 and we are deadline driven and we can't slow down, it is a gift for someone in a position of authority to say, you know what? Let's give ourselves the gift of just slowing down for a minute. Let's give ourselves an hour or a couple of hours just to process what this experience is like. What are we experiencing as we go through this? What's possible on the other side? Some of these questions that we asked, but what a gift from someone in a position of authority to be able to use their authority to just give people permission to slow down.
Take a breath.
That's pretty cool. Take a breath. It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
That's a real gift from someone in a position of authority to just, I'm doing air quotes around give permission, but really just to say to people, it's okay. It's okay for us to grab some pizza or have some lunch and just talk about what this is like and maybe even celebrate, by the way, because the other thing that's a lot of times happening in the period of transition is there's progress being made, but because it feels so murky and uncertain and emotional, we might miss progress. So a person in authority being able to say, you know what, we've actually made a lot of progress. And by the way, the people above us have noticed what we're doing. So I just want to tell you some feedback that I've heard from people who are watching what we're doing. And even though it feels murky and uncertain, we are still making progress. And I feel like we should stop and celebrate. So those are some ways leaders can show up with the team as well.
It seems that there's great benefit in that, slowing down and actually doing the work of transition, asking the reflective questions, moving yourself. And yet you talked about organizations that sometimes they don't do that, and that the person in authority can potentially offer the sanction to be able to slow down and go through that process if they recognize that. But individuals also have this problem, don't they? Where individuals will almost hit the fight, flight, or freeze mindset in a transition. And they want to get on to the next thing. And what they risk is, by not going through this reflective process, and I think teams risk this too, is repeating the mistakes of the past. That if they don't have a reset, if they don't have a recalibration, if they don't have some sense making that has gone on, and in some cases rebuilding of identity or establishing identity, then they're bound to make the same mistakes that they made in the past. Whether they were successful there or not, there's still, behaviors and mistakes and so forth that people, when they're reflective, might say, that didn't work out so well for me. Maybe I'll do it differently next time. And that awareness is important, but that awareness doesn't come unless that pause happens.
Sage advice. Yes. And I think in addition to sometimes hitting a fight, flight, or freeze response, I think the other very human thing is, I don't like how this feels, so let me hit the accelerator as quickly as I can and move on as fast as I can to run away from those feelings and experiences. I mean, I think a good example are people who get divorced and then are remarried within just a couple of months, who don't give themselves time to sort of mourn that loss and think about the new identity and just move really quickly into a new relationship. But many times I think in the desire of, I don't like the feeling of being alone. I don't want to be alone. I don't like the messy feeling of all these things that are coming up for the loss of this relationship. So we as humans, we just don't like to feel icky. Like it's just not our thing, you know? We don't like feeling icky. We don't like feeling uncertain. We don't like feeling murky because it can get us into fight, flight, or freeze, and it feels really vulnerable. So sometimes we just hit the accelerator as fast as we can.
Yeah.
And just what you said, we make the same mistakes over and over again.
So
Sage.
as we wrap up our discussion here, and by the way, the questions that Teresa, you so generously gave us, we will put those in the show notes of this podcast. So if you didn't catch them all while we were doing them, go to the show notes and you'll have a list of those, and hopefully that'll be helpful for you. What about this conversation is landing for you, Teresa, that you would really like our listeners to walk away with?
You know, in some ways, maybe it's the urgent or the what's the term for the last thing you heard is there's a bias toward it. I can't remember what the word is, but that's sort of landing for me right now is the idea of there is work that is important work that happens in that neutral zone. It is this period of great creativity and innovation. And we have to be able to withstand the uncertainty and the murkiness that sits there and the discomfort because it's not going to feel great all the time. Sometimes it might feel really exciting and sometimes it might not feel good at all. But we don't want to rush it. There's some value into leaning into that space, even if it feels icky. And that's kind of landing for me right now.
Yeah.
And I think about supporting leaders to support people to be in it. Like, who wants to be a leader to keep people feeling icky? Like, nobody does that. You know, people don't go to work going, I want to sit with people in ickiness. You know, they go to work saying, I want to make progress. But if we can recognize that there's great possibility there and that being there is not always going to feel great, we can just be with people not feeling great. And that's okay.
What sticks with me, that obviously that space sticks with me that we talked about, but also the idea of the seasons from two different realms. One of them is just the seasons of transition itself. And you're right, when you're in that fall or especially that winter season, that you are going to be in those. The question is will you do the work in those that you need to advance into spring, which is more hopeful, and ultimately summer, which is more productive. But the other part that really landed with me is your reflection on the employees who are in different seasons of their life and the richness that can be gained by working across generations and appreciating and understanding where people are, where they've come from, where they're going, and trying to harness that as a leader to be able to move a company forward. And so that one really sticks with me. Any last words for?
No, I was just thinking I love that word harness because that's the possibility for a leader is really to harness the power of the people. And knowing how to harness that power makes you a better and more effective leader to help your business or organization make progress. I think that's a great word.
Well, thank you for your time. And listeners, thank you for your time. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you for joining us on Growth Beyond Boundaries. We hope today's episode gave you the inspiration and tools to push past limits and achieve meaningful growth. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network. Your support helps us reach more people on their growth journeys. Remember, growth starts with one step, one conversation, and one decision to go beyond boundaries. Until next time, keep challenging the limits and discovering your potential. See you soon.